I am Sophia Whitmore, 26, born into a world of marble floors, expensive chandeliers, and unspoken expectations. My father owns a sprawling investment firm. My mother hosts charity galas that people talk about for months, and I grew up learning how to smile politely, even when my stomach twisted with unease. I was never a rebel. I wasn't wild or careless. I was cautious, observant, trying to exist in the shadow of perfection. Dylan Cross entered my life when I was 23. He was nothing like the men I'd been groomed to notice. Quiet, clever, with a smile that felt real in a way my father's business associates rarely were. He had a gentle energy that made people underestimate him. Well, everyone except me. We met at a mutual friend's birthday party, the kind with champagne flutes, and whispered critiques about the guest list. I noticed him immediately, not because of what he had, he appeared to have nothing, but because he seemed entirely himself. No pretension, no posturing. Those early months were intoxicating. Dylan listened, really listened, while others competed for attention. He was kind without being cloying, attentive without being intrusive. I introduced him to my family, and although they tolerated him because I seemed happy, they never truly accepted him. My father's thinly veiled looks of doubt, the polite but condescending nods at my mother's dinner parties, the whispers about him not being quite the right fit, I noticed all of it. Dylan noticed it too, but he never complained. He smiled politely, stayed modest, let me take the lead, and I adored that about him. And yet, there was always Colleen, Dylan's ex-girlfriend, a woman from his past who lingered quietly in his memory, though never openly in ours. Dylan had spoken little of her, only enough to reveal she had been a serious part of his life once. Sometimes, when he thought I wasn't looking, I'd catch his gaze drifting to the phone, a soft sigh escaping, a faraway look in his eyes. Colleen wasn't a threat. She was history. But history has a way of shaping the present. I felt it, her ghost in the corners of our conversations, in the pauses where he hesitated before speaking, in the subtle moments when his smile faltered. Our relationship grew, 6 months of courtship turning into 6 years of love, or what I thought was love. Dylan's modesty, his carefulness, even his occasional distance, these were all part of the package. I let myself believe that my presence, my devotion, my family's wealth, and my understanding of him were enough to anchor him to the present, to me. Little by little, small cracks appeared. A delayed text response, a lingering glance at the past, a flinch when his phone buzzed with a name I didn't recognize. I chalked it up to nerves, stress, the world outside our bubble. But sometimes late at night, I would lie awake listening to the silence, wondering if he missed Colleen more than he let on, and whether that distance I sensed was a wall I could ever scale. Despite all that, we planned the engagement party. I rehearsed my speech, imagined toasts filled with laughter, and pictured Dylan proudly standing by my side, finally accepted by my family. I never considered that the past, Colleen, could intrude in such a spectacular, public way. I never imagined that love, even when carefully cultivated, could collide with memory and expectation and explode. And yet here I was, trembling behind the microphone, preparing to tell Dylan and everyone else the truth my heart could no longer hold back. I had loved him, truly. But love, I realized, sometimes isn't enough when other hearts are still entangled in yesterday's shadows. In the months leading up to our engagement, the tension began subtly, almost imperceptibly at first. Dylan was still Dylan, the man I adored, but shadows of his past lingered, and the walls around him sometimes felt impenetrable. It started with small things, a phone call he would take in another room, a message that made him pause for a moment too long, an absent-minded smile that I could never quite place. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining threats that didn't exist. But instinct is rarely wrong. Dylan's family, especially his mother, seemed to sense my insecurities and, instead of comforting me, they amplified them. Polite inquiries about how I fit into their son's life often felt like accusations in disguise. "Sophia, are you sure you understand Dylan? He's complicated," his mother would say with a soft, almost warning tone. I laughed it off at first, masking my unease. But every dinner, every holiday gathering, every passing comment reminded me that they were watching, waiting, and judging. And then there were Dylan's moments with Colleen. He rarely spoke of her, but sometimes the past bled into the present in quiet ways. I would notice the way his expression softened when he received a text from someone with a female name I didn't recognize, or the way his voice carried a subtle nostalgia when he recounted old stories. I tried to dismiss it. After all, everyone has a past. But a knot of doubt began to form in my chest, tightening with each passing week. Friends, too, played their part in the subtle dissonance. They would joke about exes, about unfinished business, about how Dylan had never really let go. I smiled and nodded, though inside I felt a flicker of unease. Some comments made me laugh nervously, some pricked like tiny needles, but all of them added to the growing uneasiness I couldn't name. It wasn't just external pressure. Inside me, a seed of suspicion took root, fed by moments I couldn't explain. A fleeting shadow in Dylan's eyes, a hesitation when we discussed the future, a silence when the subject of commitment arose. He never lied, but omission can be a quiet betrayal. I began to watch him more closely, noticing things I had once overlooked. Was he distant? Distracted? I couldn't tell if it was stress, fatigue, or something else entirely. And yet, I loved him. I wanted to believe that the past, Colleen, and his family's subtle interference would not matter. I reminded myself of his warmth, his humor, his unwavering support when I needed it most. But even as I clung to that love, the tension grew. Small disagreements began to feel heavier, casual comments sharper, smiles more strained. There were nights when I lay awake, listening to the quiet hum of the city outside our apartment, wondering if Dylan's heart was entirely mine. My mind returned again and again to Colleen, the one he had loved before me. What if he still carried pieces of her with him, pieces that I could never reach? I hated myself for the thought, yet I could not stop it. By the time the engagement party approached, the seed had grown. What had once been subtle unease had blossomed into a tangible tension, a fragile thread stretched taut. Everyone around us, the family, the friends, even Dylan himself, felt the pull of the past and the weight of expectations. And I, despite my love, realized I was standing on the edge of a precipice, not knowing if our love could survive the truths we had yet to confront. The day of the engagement party arrived, with a sun that felt almost too bright, as if the universe itself knew what was coming. The Hamptons estate gleamed in the afternoon light, every detail curated by my mother. Floral arrangements in delicate pastels, polished silver trays, the faint scent of fresh gardenias lingering in the air. 200 guests had arrived, their laughter a soundtrack to what should have been a celebration. And there I was, standing beside Dylan, my hands trembling behind the folds of my gown, heart hammering against my ribs. Dylan looked effortless, as always. Navy suit pressed perfectly, hair styled just so, the charming smile that had made me fall for him years ago. But beneath that smile, I could see it. The subtle tension, the flicker of nostalgia when his eyes momentarily met the corner where Colleen had been positioned earlier in the room. My chest tightened. I had rehearsed this moment countless times in my mind, but reality always carries a weight imagination cannot prepare for. When the speeches began, my nerves dissolved into a strange mixture of adrenaline and clarity. My father-in-law toasted, praising the union, the happiness, the perfect match. I smiled politely, nodding, pretending the butterflies weren't clawing their way up my throat. And then it came, the moment I knew I could not delay. The microphone was handed to me for my speech, and as I held it, all rehearsed lines of gratitude, of smiles and toasts, fell away. I could not lie anymore. I can't marry you, I said, my voice trembling, carrying across the ornate hall. The words felt heavier than I imagined, sinking into the polished floors, reaching the ears of every guest. Dylan froze mid-smile, confusion etching his features. I pressed on, tears threatening to blur my vision, my voice growing steadier as I continued. My heart belongs to someone else. It always has. Always. The silence was immediate and deafening. 200 people stared, frozen in shock. Dylan's jaw tightened, a small tremor betraying his calm exterior. And there, across the room, Colleen stood, her expression a mix of surprise, guilt, and bewilderment. Every guest could feel the tension, the collision of private truths and public expectation. I watched Dylan carefully, noting the micro expressions that betrayed his inner turmoil. His hands clenched slightly at his sides, his mouth opening as if to speak but faltering. I knew he had feelings for Colleen, lingering in the shadows of his past. But this was not what either of us had expected. The raw honesty in my declaration forced his heart into a confrontation he had avoided for months. Sophia, he began, voice low, strained, caught between disbelief and confusion. I raised a hand, shaking my head. Don't. Just listen. My own breath came in sharp, uneven gasps as I finally spoke the truth that had festered for too long. You deserve to know, Dylan. I cannot walk into marriage when my heart is elsewhere, not out of cruelty, not out of spite, but because it is the truth. The room held its collective breath. Colleen's eyes softened, a silent understanding passing between us, though unspoken. Dylan's hands unclenched slowly, then clutched at his jacket as if trying to anchor himself to reality. The past and the present collided in that room, the memory of old love, the weight of promises unmade, and the humiliation of public exposure intertwining into a single, suffocating moment. I stepped back, letting the silence stretch. Dylan's father reached toward him, attempting to intervene, but the tension was beyond polite correction. 200 faces, including my own, witnessed the collapse of what was meant to be a celebration. Every heartbeat felt amplified, my own echoing the mixture of fear and liberation. And then I spoke the words I had rehearsed only in my mind. My heart will not and cannot be yours. It never belonged entirely to you. The tears streamed freely now, my voice unwavering despite the shaking. Dylan's gaze flicked to Colleen again, a flash of pain and longing evident, a truth he had carried silently. The room felt suspended in time, every eye locked on us, every soul bearing witness to the unraveling of our carefully constructed lives. Finally, I set the engagement ring on the gift table, a symbol of promises I could not keep, and turned toward the exit. The whispers began immediately, but I walked away, each step freeing me from the weight of pretense, even as Dylan's stunned silence followed me down the corridor. That day, 200 people witnessed a love unmasked, the collision of past and present, and the first moment of my liberation. I didn't know how to feel as I stepped out of the grand hall, the echo of my own words still ringing in my ears. Relief mingled with fear, grief tangled with liberation. I could hear whispers behind me, the rustle of expensive gowns, the murmur of disbelief, the faint gasp of someone realizing that what they thought was a perfect celebration had turned into something raw, exposed, and deeply human. My hands were trembling, and my heart pounded like a drum that refused to stop. Alone in the quiet hallway, I pressed my palm to the cold wall, taking deep, shuddering breaths. My mind raced. Did I do the right thing? Was I cruel? Was I foolish? I had imagined this moment countless times, rehearsed it in my head, and yet nothing could have prepared me for the storm of emotions flooding through me now. Each step away from Dylan, from the party, from the expectations of 200 people, felt like shedding a layer of myself I hadn't realized was weighed down by pretense. Meanwhile, Dylan stood frozen near the gift table. I could see him from the corner of the hallway, his usually composed features fractured, his hands clenched and unclenched, as though the truth had lodged itself somewhere between his heart and his throat. I knew, even without words, that he was grappling with a mixture of humiliation, heartbreak, and guilt. I could see the flicker of longing for Colleen, the hesitation that always appeared when her memory surfaced. He had loved her once deeply, and now the collision of past and present left him unmoored. I could imagine his thoughts, scattered and conflicting. Why now? Why publicly? He might have asked himself, paired with a quieter, more painful admission. Did I ever truly love her? Or am I still carrying Colleen in my heart? Every memory of their time together, every laugh, every whispered secret, came rushing back to him in that moment of chaos. The very thing that had anchored him in the past was now a mirror, reflecting everything he had misunderstood about me, about love, about honesty. I, on the other hand, wrestled with self-doubt. I loved Dylan, or at least I thought I did, but I couldn't marry him knowing my heart had already chosen another path. There was anger, too, a simmering resentment at the role we had been forced to play in each other's lives. Me, performing devotion to appease his family and mine. Him, silently holding on to a past that would never fully release him. I wondered if all those careful months, the laughs, the kisses, the quiet evenings together, had been as real to him as they had been to me, or if they had always been filtered through the lens of Colleen's shadow. I remembered our first confrontation after the announcement. Dylan had finally approached me in the solitude of the empty hallway, his voice low and measured. "Sophia." "I don't know what to say," he murmured. His eyes held a storm I recognized, hurt, confusion, and the subtle trace of longing for what had been lost. Colleen, I never expected this, and His words faltered, but I didn't let him continue. "Dylan," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "you don't have to explain. I needed to be honest. That's all I could do." He nodded, swallowing hard, the tension in his shoulders betraying the tumult inside him. I could sense his internal struggle, torn between the life he had planned with me, the expectations of his family, and the lingering feelings for Colleen. I realized then that our love, though genuine in its own way, had always been shadowed by what could not be spoken, by what had not yet been resolved. I walked to the hotel I had booked for the night, alone, letting the cool air wash over me. Each step felt like reclaiming a part of myself that had been held hostage by fear, by obligation, by the illusion of perfection. I knew there would be calls, messages, confrontations. Dylan, his family, Colleen, even friends. But for the first time in months, maybe years, I felt a strange calm. I had acted according to my heart. And as I lay on the hotel bed, staring at the ceiling, I realized something vital. The heartbreak, the humiliation, the weight of others' expectations. It was mine to carry, yes, but it was also my release. Dylan would need time to reconcile his feelings, to face the truth of what had been and what could never be. I, at least, could breathe. I had spoken my truth. I had claimed my freedom. The days after the engagement party were a storm I could not have anticipated. Dylan's parents called incessantly, each conversation more insistent, more condescending than the last. His father, Richard, spoke as though the public humiliation could be patched with business talk. "Sophia," he said one morning, voice tight with forced patience, "you don't understand the implications of what you did. Dylan, he has a future, and you've jeopardized it." I listened quietly, my knuckles whitening around the phone. Every word felt like an accusation, each sentence a reminder that to them, I had overstepped a boundary I hadn't even known existed. "I acted according to my heart," I said calmly, though my chest burned with the need to shout, to explain the complexity of love, of truth. Dylan deserved honesty. He will survive this, just as I will. But they didn't hear it. Instead, his mother chimed in, dripping condescension with every phrase. "Sophia, dear, I know you meant no harm, but our family does not take such public actions lightly. You've embarrassed us, embarrassed Dylan. We were all counting on you to maintain decorum." Even friends I had trusted became unwitting adversaries. Texts from mutual acquaintances carried thinly veiled judgment. Why humiliate him? Couldn't this have been handled privately? Or, "You're cruel, Sophia. What were you thinking?" Every message, every call, reinforced the narrative that I was the villain in someone else's story. I felt the walls closing in, the public eye amplifying the internal chaos. Meanwhile, Dylan oscillated between confronting me and retreating. He wanted to speak, to demand answers, yet every time he did, the presence of Colleen in his mind complicated him. He remembered her laugh, her subtle smiles, the intimacy of shared years that could never be replicated. I could feel the tug of his past, the pull of unresolved emotions that even he could not name. And yet, he still looked at me with a mixture of guilt, admiration, and disbelief, as if trying to reconcile the woman before him with the Sophia he thought he knew. In this chaotic web, evidence from the past, texts, old photos, lingering memories, surfaced at the worst possible moments. Messages from Dylan to Colleen, dated and innocent in context, were brought up in casual conversation by friends who didn't understand the nuance, painting me as the interloper, the destroyer of what was, rather than the truth teller of what had never been fully mine to claim. I felt the weight of misunderstanding pressing down like a physical force, each misinterpreted glance or whispered conversation a stone in the pocket of my conscience. Arguments became inevitable. Dylan and I clashed in private moments, words sharp, emotions raw. "Do you think this is easy for me?" he asked one night, hands trembling as he ran them through his hair. Every glance, every memory. It's like I'm being torn apart. "I know it's not easy," I whispered, voice cracking despite the resolve I tried to maintain. "It's not easy for me either. I loved you, I do, but I cannot be part of a life that isn't honest. I cannot marry you when my heart is bound to the truth of what I feel. This isn't about Colleen, it's about honesty, about us being who we truly are." He sank into the couch, silent, defeated. The air between us thick with the residue of hurt, confusion, and love misaligned. I realized then that the escalation was not just external, it had seeped into us, infecting our shared spaces, our interactions, even the way we breathed around each other. And in the midst of this storm, I felt a change within myself. I began to notice the strength that had been hiding behind fear, the resilience that had been dormant beneath the layers of obligation and expectation. I no longer wanted to negotiate my integrity for approval. I no longer wanted to perform, to smile, to appease. Every call from Dylan's parents, every judgmental text, every whispered comment became fuel. Not to retaliate, but to assert my existence, my worth, my right to live unshackled from others' designs. Even Dylan noticed it. During one particularly tense dinner, he leaned across the table and said, voice low, almost vulnerable, "Sophia, you're different now. I've never seen you like this." I met his gaze steadily. "I'm just being myself, Dylan, that's all." By the end of that week, the atmosphere had shifted. Friends still murmured, family still judged, but I felt a quiet empowerment blossoming within me. The escalation, the relentless pressure, the intrusion, the constant reminders of the past had forced me to confront my own fears and stand firm. I began to realize that the narrative of blame could not define me. I could choose my story, my truth, my path. And while Dylan grappled with his emotions, caught between what had been and what could not be, I felt the first flickers of clarity. Love cannot exist in a cage built by judgment, expectation, and unspoken history. True love demands honesty, courage, and the willingness to stand alone when necessary. By the end of the second week, the world felt unbearably heavy. The initial shock of the engagement party had faded, but it left behind a residue of emptiness that pressed down on me relentlessly. I wandered through my apartment, the sunlight streaming through the windows, unable to warm the cold lump in my chest. Every corner seemed to echo with what-ifs and might-have-beens. Even my own reflection in the mirror felt foreign. The calls hadn't stopped. Dylan's parents, persistent and patronizing, continued to probe, offering solutions that were thinly veiled, attempts to control, to manipulate, to force a narrative I had no desire to live in. Friends and distant relatives whispered behind my back, their voices dripping with judgment. Even the staff at the country club, who had watched the chaos unfold, avoided my eyes, leaving me with the sense that I was a pariah in a world I had once believed I belonged to. And then there was Dylan. Though he didn't call as often, every encounter, every text, every hesitant message carried the weight of confusion, longing, and residual affection for Colleen. His presence was both a comfort and a dagger. I found myself replaying the engagement party over and over, the microphone in my hands, the silence of the room, the mixture of pity and shock in the eyes of 200 witnesses. Humiliation had never felt so sharp, so all-encompassing. I tried to talk to friends, to confide in someone who might understand, but their words were empty, offering sympathy without comprehension. "It will blow over," they said, as if human hearts could simply recover from public betrayal the way a glass might survive a drop. "People will forget," they promised. But the truth is, people do not forget humiliation, and the memory gnawed at me relentlessly. Late at night, I found myself sitting on the edge of my bed, knees pulled up, staring at the ceiling. My body felt hollow, as if the act of speaking my truth had drained me entirely. I questioned everything, my decisions, my worth, even the validity of my feelings. Was I selfish? Was I cruel? Did I truly know my own heart? Each thought spiraled into another, the chain of self-doubt tightening around me like an invisible noose. Dylan's face haunted me in quiet moments, not with anger, but with the expression of someone trapped between relief and devastation. I understood him. Part of me empathized with the weight of having your past and present collide in such a public, unforgiving way, but empathy offered no solace. I was alone in the aftermath, the world having turned its judgmental gaze squarely upon me. The media coverage added another layer of pressure. Though I had avoided posting or commenting publicly, whispers of the event spread beyond the Hamptons estate. Social media, the relentless engine of gossip and spectacle, dissected every detail: the words I spoke, the tears on my gown, the shocked silence of Dylan. I felt the eyes of strangers pierce through me, as if my private anguish had been auctioned off for public scrutiny. Even sleep offered no reprieve. Nightmares replayed the party in endless loops, the microphone shaking in my hand, Dylan's stunned expression, the judgmental eyes of every guest. I woke drenched in sweat, heart racing, my hands shaking as though I had physically run a marathon I had never trained for. I longed for the simplicity of ignorance, for a world where my truth had been my secret, but the choice had been made, the consequences had come, heavy and unyielding. And yet in this darkness a small spark lingered. Buried beneath the humiliation, the loneliness, the gnawing uncertainty was a sense of survival. I was at the lowest point I had ever known, but I was still standing. I could feel the beginnings of something primal stirring, a recognition that if I could endure this, if I could face the collapse of expectations, the judgment of family, and the agony of heartbreak, then perhaps I could endure anything. That night, I allowed myself to weep fully, the sobs racking my body, the tears flowing freely without shame. It was a surrender, but also a release. I acknowledged the depth of my pain, naming it, feeling it, letting it exist without judgment. And as the darkness pressed in, I realized something crucial. Hitting rock bottom was not the end. It was a threshold. Beyond it lay clarity, strength, and the possibility of reclaiming my life on my own terms. The dark moment had arrived. The isolation, the betrayal, the crushing weight of public exposure, they had stripped away every illusion. And in that raw, vulnerable space, I began to sense the faint outline of a new self emerging, one capable of action, of boundaries, of reclaiming dignity and direction. The morning after the longest night of my life, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. My apartment was quiet, the sunlight soft and unjudging, filtering through the curtains, as if the world itself had paused to give me space. For the first time since the engagement party, I didn't feel the weight of judgment pressing on my chest. Instead, a resolve was forming, steady and undeniable. I reached for my phone, hesitant, expecting another barrage of calls from Dylan, his parents, or even Colleen, but it was silent. A small relief, yet I knew the calm was temporary. I needed to act, not react, and for that, I had to understand the full scope of what had happened and what had been hidden from me all along. I opened the folder Dylan's assistant had sent after the party, documents outlining his real financial standing and past decisions he had kept private. Reading through the papers, I felt a mix of shock and awe. Here was a man I thought I knew completely, yet there were layers I had never glimpsed. Investments, company valuations, charitable contributions, all meticulously managed, quietly impressive. The man who had seemed, for all these months, ordinary or struggling, was in reality extraordinary in a way I had never appreciated because the truth had been deliberately hidden. At first, I felt a pang of guilt. Was I wrong to judge? Did I misread everything? But then another realization struck me. Dylan had concealed his reality not to deceive, but to protect himself from the world, and perhaps, unknowingly, from me. He had been tested in his own way, revealing the truth only when it mattered most. Then a message from an unexpected source arrived. Colleen. I hesitated before opening it, wary of old wounds, yet compelled by curiosity. Her words were calm, measured, and surprisingly clarifying. Sophia, I need you to know the truth. You weren't the obstacle, and I never wanted to come between you and Dylan. You did what was honest. He is struggling with his past and the expectations placed on him. Please, don't let anyone make you feel less than you are. Reading that, something inside me shifted. The fog of guilt, shame, and self-doubt began to lift. The humiliation of the engagement party, the public exposure, the whispers, the judgment, no longer had the power to define me. For the first time, I saw the situation for what it truly was, a reflection of Dylan's unresolved attachments, his family's expectations, and the societal pressures that had cornered us both. Not my failure, not my shame. I realized then that I had a choice. I could continue to be trapped in the narrative others had written for me, Dylan's family, my friends, even my own expectations of love. Oh, or I could reclaim my agency. The proof of Dylan's integrity, the clarity in Colleen's message, the undeniable knowledge of my own strength, they combined to form an unassailable truth. I deserved respect, honesty, and love that recognized my full worth. That afternoon, I confronted Dylan. The air between us was thick with unsaid words, emotions teetering on the edge of confrontation and confession. Dylan, I began, voice steady yet soft. I've seen the truth now. I understand more than I ever did, and I know what I need to do. He looked at me, a mixture of apprehension and hope in his eyes. Sophia, You don't get to define me, I interrupted gently. Not your parents, not Colleen, not anyone else. I've carried too much weight to be swayed by judgment or expectation. I can no longer live in a world where my voice is silenced by others' assumptions. He remained silent, searching my face as though trying to read a map of my soul. I continued, I am stepping away from everything that doesn't honor who I am. I will not marry you, Dylan, and I will not let anyone convince me that my truth is wrong. In that moment, I felt a surge of power, not vindictive, not triumphant, but serene and grounded. For the first time in months, the chaos outside did not penetrate my core. I was no longer reacting. I was choosing. Choosing clarity over confusion, dignity over humiliation, self-respect over obligation. Dylan nodded slowly, understanding at last what he had been struggling to grasp. I get it, he said, voice barely above a whisper. I wish I could have been honest sooner. I know, I replied, my gaze unwavering. But the past is not mine to rewrite. What matters now is that we walk forward, each of us free to live authentically. That's the only way to honor the truth. As I left his apartment that evening, the city lights shimmered around me like a promise. The burden of expectation and judgment, of secrecy and misperception, was lifting. I was not stepping into vengeance or regret, but into sovereignty, an embrace of the self I had rediscovered in the aftermath of betrayal and chaos. This was the turning point, the moment when humiliation transformed into insight, when despair became the seed of resilience, and when the power of choice, my choice, emerged stronger than any outside pressure. I was no longer the girl defined by others' narratives. I was Sophia, fully aware, fully present, and fully capable of reclaiming her life. In the days following my decision, the consequences of truth and choice began to ripple outward like concentric circles in a pond. Dylan's parents, previously so insistent and controlling, suddenly seemed unsure, their confident assertions replaced by awkward silences. Calls went unanswered. Invitations to discuss business opportunities vanished. The carefully constructed facade of influence and authority they had projected wavered, exposing the cracks beneath. Meanwhile, Dylan himself struggled. He had spent years living under the weight of expectations, his past with Colleen, the judgment of his family, and the obligations he felt toward me. Now, confronted with my unwavering clarity, he found himself unmoored. He wanted to explain, to justify, to repair, but the truth was already set in motion. No apology, no charm, no attempt to manipulate could undo the choices I had made. Colleen, surprisingly, emerged as a stabilizing force. She contacted Dylan, not to rekindle anything, but to clarify her own position. She explained that she had never intended to interfere, that the public spectacle had been a misinterpretation of reality. Dylan, forced to reconcile what he had imagined with what was true, faced the discomfort of understanding that much of the chaos had been of his own making. Friends and acquaintances who had once whispered behind my back or judged my actions were confronted with the reality of the situation. They saw the public unraveling of Dylan's carefully curated image, and with it, the fragility of the status and connections he had relied upon. The admiration or envy that some had shown was replaced by quiet reflection, or, in some cases, overt embarrassment. The social circles that had once revolved around him began to shift, some quietly distancing themselves, others reevaluating loyalties. I, on the other hand, moved through these ripples with a calm I had not known I possessed. I returned the calls I deemed necessary, addressed any misunderstandings with clear, concise explanations, and allowed the rest to resolve naturally. I did not seek revenge, nor did I seek validation. I simply allowed the truth to exist and let the consequences unfold. One morning, as I walked through the familiar streets of my neighborhood, the subtle shifts became apparent. Formerly judgmental friends avoided eye contact. A few who had previously criticized me offered quiet nods of acknowledgement, and strangers who might have gossiped now seemed indifferent. The world was continuing without me as a character in its drama, and yet, paradoxically, I had never felt more present. Dylan, in his own way, began to face the fallout in more personal terms. His parents' disappointment was no longer a tool for manipulation. It was a mirror reflecting his inability to control outcomes through charm or strategy. Business contacts that had been tenuously linked to familial connections found themselves reevaluating their engagements, realizing that the foundation of trust and influence Dylan had relied upon was more fragile than assumed. Through it all, I maintained my composure. I packed my belongings from the apartment I had shared with him for the sake of appearances arranged for movers, and handled practical matters without drama. My engagement ring, once a symbol of impending union, was returned to the jeweler quietly, accompanied by a note of clarity. No bitterness, no blame, just a statement of personal resolution. In these quiet actions, I felt the deep satisfaction of reclaiming agency. Each decision, each movement, was a reaffirmation that my life was mine, defined not by the expectations of others, but by my own values and choices. Dylan's social network, once a source of subtle pressure, now struggled to accommodate the reality that the narrative had shifted irrevocably. And yet, the most profound fallout was internal. Dylan had to face himself, his attachments, his misjudgments, and his own role in the unraveling of what had seemed like a perfect engagement. For me, the fallout was liberating. It was a release from chains I had not fully recognized I was carrying, an affirmation that integrity and honesty, even when painful, could restore a sense of self-worth and direction. By the end of the month, life had taken on a new rhythm. I had found a new apartment, smaller but filled with light and quiet spaces for reflection. I returned to work with renewed focus, my ambitions now tempered with the wisdom of experience. Dylan continued to navigate the consequences of his past actions, and while our paths would inevitably cross again in some social or professional context, I knew, unequivocally, that the woman I had become could face him without fear or regret. In the calm after the storm, I realized something essential. Truth, once embraced, has a power all its own. It may cause discomfort, upheaval, or even humiliation, but it cannot be undone. And in embracing that truth, I had reclaimed not just my dignity, but my life. The fallout was not a punishment, it was the natural consequence of clarity, a mirror reflecting the consequences of choices made without honesty or courage. I stepped into my new life with quiet strength, aware that the world had shifted around me, but more importantly, aware that I had shifted within myself. For the first time, I felt unshackled from expectation, free from the need to perform or appease, and empowered to choose a path defined by authenticity and self-respect. 6 months had passed since that fateful engagement party, and in that time, my life had transformed in ways I hadn't anticipated. The humiliation, the chaos, the heartbreak, they had all become catalysts, shaping a version of myself I was only beginning to recognize. I had rebuilt not just my environment, but my sense of self, carefully, deliberately, and with unwavering intent. I met George about 4 months after the engagement ended. She was a veterinarian, fiercely independent, with a sense of humor that could cut through the heaviest of days. From our first meeting, she insisted on equality, splitting bills, sharing decisions, and valuing conversation over status or wealth. In her, I saw a reflection of the principles I had rediscovered in myself: integrity, authenticity, and the courage to choose wisely. In George's presence, I felt the luxury of being seen for who I truly was. My accomplishments, my finances, even my past missteps were acknowledged, but never used as leverage or judgment. I laughed freely, loved cautiously, but openly, and felt the warmth of a partnership built on mutual respect rather than necessity or expectation. The experience with Dylan, Colleen, and his family had left a scar, but it was not one of shame. It was a lesson etched deep into my understanding of human relationships. I learned that love is never transactional, that honesty, even when uncomfortable, is the cornerstone of connection, and that no one should dictate your worth based on perception, money, or convenience. Perhaps the most important lesson I carry is this: your value is intrinsic. It is not determined by another's recognition, approval, or affection. It is measured by how faithfully you live your truth, how courageously you face adversity, and how decisively you reclaim your agency in moments of vulnerability. The engagement disaster, as public and painful as it had been, was also the moment I discovered my resilience and self-respect. Looking back, I realize now that sometimes the worst experiences are the ones that save us from investing in the wrong lives, wrong expectations, and wrong attachments. Being humiliated before 200 people was excruciating, yet it liberated me from a relationship that was never aligned with my authentic self. The very event that felt like the collapse of my world became the foundation of my rebirth. As I sip coffee in my new apartment, watching sunlight pour across the floor, I feel a quiet strength settle within me. I am no longer defined by others' choices or perceptions. I am Sophia, fully present, fully aware, and fully in control of my story. And as I continue forward, I carry this truth: real love, real respect, and real fulfillment are never about compromise at the expense of self. They are about choosing and being chosen for who you truly are.